Welcome back to yet another of our queer history streams that we are doing for Pride Month 2024. And today I want to talk about something that is pretty important in the grand scheme of not just history, but how it relates to our current present. Because the way that we often hear it from ideologues like Matt Walsh, Libs of TikTok, Michael Knowles, plenty of other people we've heard about, is that being trans is a recent fad, that gender nonconformity is specifically a kind of ideological disease that has infected the West, particularly in academia, and that teachers are trying to infiltrate and indoctrinate kids to being trans. It won't surprise you if you've followed my channel or if you do any of your own research to know this is not true. And in fact, as we're going to show today, non-binary, gender non-conforming, transgender people, there are so many different words for them, and there have been for literally not hundreds, but thousands of years, because people who identify, and society has identified as outside of a traditional two-gender spectrum, have always had a place in society. Because I can see some people saying, okay, well, if it's just in tribal societies, that doesn't really count. Or if it's just in like Native American societies, no. I don't just mean in one or two societies. I mean trans people, people who are gender ambiguous, gender nonconforming, have existed everywhere for all time. So I wanted to start off with a brief map from PBS on gender diverse cultural identities. And then we're going to go through some specifics, both through history leading all the way up to the modern world, where I want to talk a little bit about the history of the study of gender as it applies to trans people and queer people today. Because it often gets wrapped up in conversations about a man named John Money, who you will hear if you get into arguments with people who are wrong on Twitter or YouTube. You will hear people say, John Money invented gender ideology. John Money invented transgenderism. This is not true, and we will talk about that as well towards the end. Throughout recorded history and since time immemorial, thriving cultures have recognized, revered, and integrated more than two genders. Terms such as transgender, gay, or bisexual are Western constructs that often assume three things: that there are only two sexes, as many as three sexualities, and only two genders. Even after the end of the modern era and as the colonial period wanes, hundreds of distinct indigenous societies around the globe still retain their long-established traditions of third, fourth, fifth, or more genders. The subject of two spirits, Fred Martinez, for example, was not a boy who wanted to be a girl, but both a boy and a girl, an identity his Navajo culture recognized and is revered as Nalihi. I believe, I will say, upfront pronunciations, I'm going to mess up today. I'm going to mess up today because there's a lot of different pronunciations across a lot of different eras of history, so give me a break. I'm doing my best, as always, but like, I need a little bit of a break. Meanwhile, Hina of Kimuhina is part of a native Hawaiian culture that has traditionally revered and respected Mahu, those who embody both male and female spirit. It's not uncommon for third gender people to perform critical spiritual and religious functions in their communities. Among many indigenous societies, two prominent features often distinguish the lives and social roles of third gender persons from those of cisgender or contemporary transgender persons in non-indigenous societies. First is that many indigenous terms for third gender people contain both the word for man and woman in their construction, and that third gender people are seen as embodying both of these genders in diverse ways. The second is that the history of many third genders is in the community role of religious specialists, which also takes diverse forms, depending on the beliefs of diverse cultures. While not all third gender persons are defined in these terms, across our species, this phenomenon of the third gender religious specialist, healer, or spiritual worker has been part of our collective identity and human experience since time immemorial. It's important to note this up front, that many cultures have different conceptions of gender and gender roles. And it's hard to, in the broadest terms, we, as from a Western perspective, would describe them using umbrella terms, right? Using terms like non-binary, transgender, or even gender non-conforming. However, that is because we come from a social construct that recognizes two primary genders and then everything else, right? So when they talk about how they're different than how we see man and woman and different gender identities, it's not ever going to be a one-to-one match, right? But that's why we create words. We create words to help encapsulate an idea and help better convey it and understand it. So some people are probably not going to like saying that, oh, these identities are transgender. If you call, for example, certain indigenous identities transgender, because it summons to mind for them, it summons to mind the idea that, oh, these people aren't the same as like a trans woman, somebody who specifically transitions from male to female, or vice versa, a trans man. However, it's important to keep in mind that much like terms like non-binary fall under a trans umbrella, is that trans identity, transgender, is a very wide subject that encompasses a lot of different ideas and identities. And these are, like, by definition, these are some of them. Like, these are some of those ideas. Within Western societies, despite centuries of suppression, there are still traces of a past when third or fourth or more genders were recognized within many cultures and societies. In rare cases, they presently exist. An example of this would be the Bernesha of Albania, women who give up their social role as women to live as men. Likewise, within Jewish culture and law, as many as 8 genders have been historically recognized and in diverse ways. This just seems like I wanted to go over this. These are very brief, little tiny examples. For example, the Chukchi, and neighboring indigenous peoples of Siberia, including the Koryak and the Kamkadel, are nomadic people whose traditional folk religious beliefs include third-gender shamans who assume the dress and social role of the opposite gender. The Mahu of Hawaii, which we'll read about more in a bit. Winkte, I talked about this in my speech. The Lakota Winkte, word for two-spirit people like the Navajo, Nadlihi, and Dilba. Winkte are born male but live as women and assume many traditional women's roles such as cooking and caring for children, as well as assuming key roles in rituals and serving as the keeper of the tribe's oral traditions. Today, Winkte are treated both with respect as members of Lakota society and also often are on the receiving end of increased homophobia or transphobia within Lakota society. Another important thing to talk about here is that when it comes to different gender roles in culture, there are a lot of societies, and this is, again, a thing that happened all over, whether they were tribes of Vikings, whether they were tribes out on the steppes way back in the day in Asia, Africa, all up into Egypt, the Syrian Empire, like all of that stuff, whether they were tribal cultures in Southeast Asia or in the Americas. Tribal culture was a lot more communal. And this isn't true of all tribes, but by and large, tribal culture was a lot more communal than our conception of modern living was. Where you saw here that in some tribes, a man, somebody who was born a man, would take on the role of a woman and would help with childcare. Now, that sounds weird today because, like, wait, whose child are you going to take care of? And it's like they would take care of child as a tribe. This is where the term "it takes a village" comes from, where people say, oh, it takes a village. The point of that term is it takes a village to raise a child, usually, which is to say that a child usually is more than just the influences of their parents. It includes their neighbors in like a modern cultural context. The Mojave Aliha and Huame recognizes 4 genders: men, women; Huame, female body person who live as men; and Aliha, male body persons who live as women. The creation myth of the Mojave tribe speaks to a time when humans were not sexually or gender differentiated. Historically, Huame and Aliha often transitioned to this third gender status when they began to identify as homosexual, which was seen as a result of spiritual intervention, taking on the social roles and dress of the opposite sex, and often becoming healers or other religious specialists. So this is another commonality and through line that we're going to see throughout our brief study here, is that so many different cultures, from ancient Rome to Africa, saw being transgender as something, and again, a modern conception, what we would call transgender, saw being something outside of the traditionally ascribed role of gender as something to be respected or cherished, whether that was in a religious or spiritual aspect, Sometimes that even happened in government bodies, as we'll read about when we get to some Iron Age stuff. The Muxe, or the Zapotec of Oaxaca. Muxe are males who engage in performances of gender that include dressing in women's clothing and or wearing makeup. They may adopt feminine social roles such as working in embroidery, but may also work in traditionally male careers. In recent decades, the term has been used outside to describe gay men, but Muxe may be of any sexual orientation. Guevedoche. In the Dominican Republic, approximately 1% of the population possesses an intersex genetic trait known as 5-alpha reductase hermaphroditism, being born with ambiguous genitals but possessing XY chromosomes so their genitals masculinize at puberty. These Guevedoche, roughly translated as testicles at 12, are recognized as third gender and have an ambivalent gender socialization, though usually live as men. Incas worshipped Chiqui Shinche, a dual-gendered god who was served by Kwariwarmi, man-woman, third-gender ritual, and ceremonial attendance. The Kwariwarmi wore androgynous or women's clothing and were often identified for this role during childhood. Like third-gender people worldwide, especially those with religious and spiritual functions, they were subject to persecution and genocide on religious grounds during the colonial period. Now this gets at, that we're going to notice here, there's a commonality in the time that all of the acceptance towards these third religions goes away. And I'll give you no prizes for guessing what it is. It's colonialism, generally speaking. We'll talk about that, especially when it comes to gender nonconforming people in Japan and Japan's kind of lost third gender. Feminino refers to a third gender of persons assigned male at birth who dress as women and assume female gender roles in Neapolitan society. Until the 19th century, their status in society was privileged, and they practiced rituals based on Greek mythology related to Hermaphroditus, an intersex child of the deities Aphrodite and Hermes, and to Tiresias, a prophet of Apollo who transformed into a woman for 7 years. In contemporary Italy, they're seen as good luck and have ritual functions within some local Catholic rituals and celebrations. The term has also been used to describe transgender persons in news media, essentially in a derogative manner. While recognition of genders outside male and female has only recently been discussed in Western societies, in Hindu society, people of non-binary gender expression have played important roles for over 2,000 years. Now, again, this is one of those great times when I should remind everybody that non-binary gender expression is a wide umbrella, and it is specifically meant to encompass a wide array of things. Like when you have dorks who are always saying like, you ever think about how by being non-binary you're actually breaking it into a binary of binary and non-binary. It's like, no, not really, because it encompasses so many other ideas and identities. Hijra is a good example of that. Called the third gender, evidence for their existence in Hindu society can be found in Hindu holy texts like the Ramayana and Mahabharata, where Hindu hero Arjuna becomes the third gender. Third gender people have often been revered through South Asian history. For example, Muslim rulers of the Mughal Empire from the 15th to 19th century were generous patrons of third gender Indians. Many rose to significant positions of power under both Hindu and Muslim rulers. In 2014, it was estimated that around 3 million third gender people live in India alone. Now, the thing with the Hijras that I find super fascinating is that they have an entire culture unto themselves, where if people choose to identify as Hijra, they go off to essentially live in small communes with other Hijra, which we'll read about in a second here. Hijras are often born male but look and dress in traditionally feminine ways. Many, not all, choose to undergo a castration ceremony, removing their male genitalia as an offering to Hindu goddess Bahukara Mata. Other Hijras are born intersex, often called transgender by outsiders. Indian societies and most Hijras consider themselves to be third gender, neither male nor female, not transitioning. They are a different gender altogether. However, Hijra identity is complex, and recently some have identified as transgender and sought gender reassignment procedures. A young person is initiated by following a guru or teacher who will lead the Kela or disciple in the Hijra way of life. This includes leaving their home in order to live in community with other Hijras to learn the ritual roles they would perform in Hindu households. Hijra are expected to perform dances, songs, and blessings at both births and weddings of Hindus. To many Hindus, a Hidra's blessing of a baby will confer fertility, prosperity, and long life on the child. To many Hindus, it is the third gender nature of Hijras, including their sacrifice of their procreative ability to the goddess, that grants Hijras this incredible religious power. In fact, Hijras can also curse a family if they are disrespectful or refuse to pay for the blessings. Many Hindus take these blessings and curses very seriously. Hijras say they only curse in extreme circumstances. While Hijras are often invited to perform these rituals, they also attend births and marriages unannounced, claiming the right to attend as their sacred religious duty. Fearful of receiving a curse from Hijras, Hindu families often welcome them in and pay them for their services even when uninvited. However, some Hindu families refuse to pay them, even going as far as calling the police. Historically and culturally, Hijras are based in Hinduism. However, Hijras are not all Hindu themselves. Many are Muslim and a few Christian. For example, some Hijras center their community around the Hindu goddess Bahukara Mata, while also taking a Muslim name and observing Islamic traditions such as Ramadan. Just as Hijra are not limited by binary views of gender, some are not limited by a single religious tradition. And they are also... Okay, so here's where colonization comes in. And this is another example of... this is another example that we will see continue of colonizing really wiping out a lot of gender expression. While Hijras have been treated with both fear and respect for thousands of years, much of this respect did not survive Hinduism's encounter with colonialism. The British colonized most of South Asia in the 19th and 20th century and were shocked by third-gender people. Based in Christian beliefs about gender at the time, the British named all Hijras criminals in 1871 and instructed colonial authorities to arrest them on sight. However, because of their important religious functions, Hijras persisted without significant interruption. Still, nearly 200 years of stigmatization by the British eventually took a toll. While Hijras have maintained their traditional rights, and the 1871 law was repealed shortly after independence, today they are often treated with contempt. They are almost always excluded from employment and education outside of their religious roles. As a result, they are often stricken by poverty and forced to resort to begging and prostitution to survive. They are often victims of violence and abuse, harassed by police, and refuse treatment at hospitals. Recently, Hijras regained some of the rights and freedoms they have been denied. In 2014, India, Nepal, and Bangladesh had all officially recognized third-gender peoples as citizens deserving of equal rights. The Supreme Court of India stated, quote, "It is the right of every human being to choose their gender, and that recognition of the group, quote, is not a social or medical issue, but a human rights issue." They directed the government to open education and job opportunities to all third-gender groups. While progress has been slow, in 2015, the first Hijra mayor in India was elected in the city of Raigarh. And in 2017, the city of Kochi hired 23 Hijra to work for their public transit system. Still, progress is slow, and most third-gender people remain in poverty, even as they continue to bless Hindu families with prosperity. Let's go over to, and this one is going to be one that everybody loves to hear, the cult of Cybele. Ancient gender nonconforming Romans found refuge in a community dedicated to a goddess. And this actually has, if I go into it, I might go into it because there's actually a really fascinating story. I don't think I will because we have so much more to go through. But there is a fascinating story behind why this particular goddess came to Rome. And it has to do with like lead poisoning and Hannibal. And it's a really interesting historical story that I will put in there. But as a scholar of Greek and Latin literature, I had studied the Galli, male followers of the goddess Cybele. Their appearance and behaviors, often considered feminine, were commented on extensively by Roman authors. They were said to curl their hair, smooth their legs with pumice stones, and wear fine clothing. They also, but not always, surgically remove their testicles. In the philosophical treatise Hymn to the Mother of the Gods, Julian the philosopher, the last pagan emperor of the Roman Empire, writes about the history of the cult of Cybele. In this treatise, he describes the cult main figures and how some of its rites were performed. Often referred to as the Mother of the Gods, Cybele was first worshipped in Anatolia. Her most famous cult site was located at Pesinus, the modern Turkish village of Beylikhisar, about 95 southwest of Ankara, where Julian stopped to pay a visit on his journey to Antioch in 362 CE. See, like anything that was in the Bible, I got it. I nailed it. I can do it. Not a problem. Cybele was known in Greece by around 500 BCE and introduced to Rome somewhere between 205 and 204 BCE, where she came to be recognized as the mother of the state. Her worship was incorporated into the official roster of Roman cults, and her temple was built on the Palatine, the political center of Rome. The cult gave rise to a group of male followers or attendants known as Galli. Among the surviving material evidence related to their existence are sculptures, as well as a Roman burial of an individual Gallus discovered in northern England. It does not seem out of the ordinary to think that some Galli were drawn to Cybele's cult because it offered them a way to escape the strict binary gender system of the Romans. Galli, unlike other men in Rome or its empire, were able to freely present themselves or live as women, regardless of their assigned sex or how they identified. Catullus' poem and comments by other authors indicate that they perceived the gender of the Galli as differing from Roman concept of masculinity. However, the Galli were also reluctantly respected for the role they played in Cybele's cult. It is thus hard to know what exactly joined their communities and how they saw themselves, and whether the sources describe them accurately. It is tempting to see the Galli as non-binary or transgender individuals, even though the Romans did not know or use concepts such as non-binary or transgender, which we've spoken about. Still, it is not inconceivable that a number of individuals found in the Galli both a community and an identity that allowed them to express themselves in a way that traditional Roman manhood did not permit. And I want to talk about the Mushi, Mexico's third gender, are now part of a worldwide LGBTQ+ movement. The Mushi are Zapotec people who view themselves as neither man nor woman, but instead a distinct third gender. Identified as male at birth, they embody female characteristics in presentation, behavior, and professions, which once earned them contempt and scorn. Today, though prejudices persist, in general they are accepted. Today, though prejudices persist, in general they are accepted, even admired on their home turf. Elvis Guerra, 30, the Queen-in-Waiting, explains that the Mushi stand in solidarity with burgeoning gender rights movements worldwide, pronouncing themselves trailblazers of cultural preservation and inclusion in a rural bastion of Catholicism. Quote, "We share the same fight as the LGBT community," who is also a published poet, lawyer, and head of a company producing fabrics with indigenous motifs. God damn. Mexico's legacy of machismo and Roman Catholicism had fostered hostility to homosexuality and alternatives to conventional gender norms. That has begun to change slowly in recent decades. Mexico City now holds an annual pride parade that is among the world's largest. Last year, same-sex finally became legal in every state. But the November slaying of Jesus Ociel Baena, a non-binary magistrate and prominent LGBTQ+ activist in the central state of Aguascalientes, that's actually not that hard of a word. I tripped up for that. Aguascalientes was a reminder of continuing intolerance and crime against gay, trans, and non-binary people. Police called the killing a murder-suicide, not a hate crime, saying the judge's partner stabbed the victim before killing himself. But the magistrate's family and advocates have voiced skepticism, citing threats against the activists and Mexico's long history of ignoring or covering up crimes targeting individuals because of their gender or orientation. Mushis had long been prevented from wearing women's clothes in formal parades and were often denied educational opportunities and jobs. We were just talking about this. Another commonality we see with people like the Hijra, people like hell. This is exactly the kind of thing that we know we've seen all the time. How many times have we seen on Twitter some conservative talking about like, oh, I'm a small business owner, and if I get they them on a employment opportunity, I just throw it in the trash. Like that is something that conservatives want to be able to do more openly than ever before. In the 1970s, the Mushi launched what they view as a liberation movement, including public protests and appeals to police and politicians. At the same time, left-wing movements were sweeping the Isthmus, a part of Mexico with a long and proud history of rebellion and cultural independence, providing an opening for the Mushi to throw their support behind political reform. Across the globe, there are examples of other indigenous communities like the Mushi who don't fit in the standard binary gender matrix. Among them are the Hijras of South Asia, like we've talked about, the Cathois of Southeast Asia, and the Fa'afafine of Polynesia. Like the Mushi, members of these groups say their gender identities date back centuries, which they do. Many Mesoamerican cultures, including the Zapotec civilization that dominated this region for centuries, were more accepting of gender diversity than the Spanish who arrived in the 16th century. Gosh, where are we hearing that again? It just seems like, it becomes so clear when you study so many different social constructs, right? Things that developed organically between all of these different areas and groups and tribes, right? Like, there were never any contact between the indigenous people of Mesoamerica and the Greeks or the Romans, or the Hijra, or as we'll talk about in a little bit, the Japanese. Or, well, there probably was between Mesoamerica and the indigenous Americans. But you have all of these cultures separated by kingdoms, by cities, by empires. Yet, across all of these different identities, tribes, nations, states, kingdoms, empires, we talked about the Mughal Empire under Muslim rule through the 14th and 18th centuries, recognizing and respecting hijras. All of them had different understandings, but understandings nonetheless. That there are people who just naturally are different. They identify, their spirit, their soul, whatever you want to call it, is different. That they are happier when they are not constrained to a role that they do not fit for, despite what was assigned to them at birth. When people like to say, oh, well, being trans is unnatural. It's not natural to be gay. It's not natural to do this. If it's not natural, then how and why did it apparently happen in every major civilization at one point or another? Before colonialism, before settler colonialism. If it's not natural, then why are there non-binary identities, gender non-conforming identities that were recognized, respected, understood as far back as 5,000 years ago? Kind of seems like there's always just been people like this. And as much as it makes me sound like, the yelling caricature of like a snowflake lib, a very cis heteronormative culture has over time attempted again and again to stamp those out because they're a threat to that idea of superiority. Quote, the Spanish saw everything through a colonial Catholic lens, said Lynn Stephen, an anthropologist at the University of Oregon who has studied the Muxi. All across Mexico and Latin America, there's evidence of the Spanish being very upset about anyone who didn't conform to what we would now call a heterosexual, monogamous, married Catholic life. The Muxi say they managed to maintain their essential character, often clandestinely, despite centuries of hostility and repression from Spanish and Mexican authorities. We are Muxis, a gender identity in a society that remains totally machista, said Guerra. We're also protecting our Zapotec indigenous culture and language. The Muxi population numbers in the thousands, experts estimate, but there is no consensus. Many gay and trans people in Mexico City and elsewhere call themselves Muxis, though community leaders here concerned about a cultural appropriation say only Zapotec people from the Isthmus can qualify. Inspired by Muxi tradition, Mexican immigrants in Southern California organized an annual gala, Via Muxi de Las Vegas. De Las. All right, I wanted to do this one next because we have not yet talked about, and I saw somebody mention it earlier, we have not yet talked about Africa. And this was an interesting article that I found on the very subject. And would you believe it? And now I want you to guess. Why might we not think or consider Africa in conversations of gender diversity? It's probably because of settler colonialism. Like most things. Yeah, Diz is living. We talked about the Lakota and the Winkte earlier. Africa, a group comprised of 55 countries, is vast in histories, ethnic groups, languages, and relationships to colonization. While Western societies glean the reputation of being forward thinkers in regard to gender identity and queerness, Africa is renowned as being a site of violence and intolerance for queer black Africans. As black folks of the diaspora look to learning about Africa's past to combat the sting of white supremacy, there is yet another benefit to delving deep into the continent's history. In particular, its history of gender nonconformity and queerness erased by the brutality of colonialism. Quote, despite a long history of transgender realities in Africa, many modern transgendered people there experience well-warranted fear because of hostilities in their families, tribes, and nations. Much of the modern hostile response has been placed in the influence of European culture, both because of a colonial past and because of contemporary pressure or the influence of foreign relations. Nevertheless, as in the past, so now transgender people are active members of their communities seeking to effect positive changes. Africa's rich past of gender nonconformity, coupled with transgender behaviors and trans realities, is deeply embedded within various ethnic groups across the continent. What do you want, Kat? Oh my God. I'm going to go try and give her some more food, I guess. Good God. Before the implementation of rigid European binaries within the Daga tribe of Ghana, Burkina Faso, and the Ivory Coast, gender identity was determined differently. Shaman Maladono Some of the Dagaba says that gender to the tribe is not dependent on sexual anatomy. It is purely energetic. In that context, one who is physically male can vibrate female energy and vice versa. That is where the real gender is. The Igbo of Nigeria, also in West Africa, quote, appear to assign gender around age 5. In Central Africa, the Budi do not designate a specific gender to a child until after puberty, in direct contrast to Western society. The tribe worships Nomo, ancestral spirits who are described as androgynous, intersex, and mystical creatures, and whom are also referred to as the teachers. In an uncircumcised penis, the foreskin is representative of femininity, while the clitoris is considered to represent masculinity. Africa's eastern region is home to other tribes who appear to embrace gender nonconforming behavior, according to Bullock. When anthropologist Brian McDermott lived among the Nuer people of Ethiopia, he observed the tribe's acceptance of a transgender woman in a village. Quote, he encountered an individual among the Nuer people of Ethiopia who not only appeared in feminine dress and acted as female, but was actually regarded as having become a woman. No physical change of sex had transpired, yet this person was free to occupy a feminine identity and role, even to the extent that marriage to a man was permissible. McDermott was informed that the prophet of Deng had consulted the spirits and then declared the change in this individual's status, which the people accepted. Here transpired an outcome more certain and favorable than many individuals who actually undergo sexual assignment surgery and legal identity change experience in our culture, parenthetical, which so commonly and arrogantly perceives itself as more enlightened. Elsewhere in Ethiopia, the Amhara, quote, allow room for intermediate, mixed, or third gender expression. The Otero, to the northeast in the Sudan, follow the same blueprint when it comes to assessing gender identity. Now, this is particularly interesting. Some of you might remember Matt Walsh's critically acclaimed classic documentary, What is a Woman?, where his way of proving that, well, trans people are just like a Western thing, like nobody else in the world believes in this or has this, was to go to a particularly homophobic tribe and do this. So we're going to watch that real quick, because literally everything we just read about modern conceptions in African tribal culture contradicts the narratives laid out by conservative people like Matt Walsh.
A woman has its own duty, and a man has its own duty, and a lady cannot do the duty of a man, and a man cannot do a duty of a woman.
Can a man become a woman?
No.
No?
No.
What about a transgender? Transgender?
No.
No?
It will look like if you want to become a lady but you're a man, you have something wrong in your mind. Something wrong in your family, something wrong in you.
What about if someone was non-binary?
Come again?
Non-binary?
Uh-huh.
Do you know, like non, like someone is
you're not a woman, you're not a man.
Yeah, someone is neither. There's something else. Is that?
He's saying we have never seen things like those. For a man,
now, the entire point of this, and if you haven't watched Jesse Gender's video talking about Matt Walsh and talking about particularly this video, Jesse does a much better job at tearing this apart, a incredibly thorough job at tearing this apart, and much better than I could ever do here, especially in such a limited time. But for the short notes, as we've just read through, several different cultures in Africa that recognize third genders, that recognize transgender identities, that respect them as part of the tribe. So the next time you see somebody saying, or a transphobe tries to link this video, or somebody like we had earlier in chat, we had somebody saying, trying to perpetuate the idea that only rich people, that it's some bourgeoisie thing to be trans. It's not true. There have always been trans people of every socioeconomic vector, of every part in life, and in every part of the world. And just because one tribe doesn't understand that, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist in Africa, as we see here. Now, let's talk about the native Hawaiian Mahu, and they are reclaiming their history. In the middle of Waikiki, Hawaii's most crowded, most photographed, most highly trafficked neighborhood, there is a monument to native Hawaiian culture that is also perhaps one of our most overlooked. In plain view, between the ever-popular Duke Kahanamoku statue and the elegant Moana Surfrider Hotel are 4 large but otherwise unassuming stones that hold a powerful and misunderstood history. Known as I almost read Pohatu. Ka Pohaku Kahuna Kapamahu, the healer stones of Kapamahu. These ancient stones, which have been sanctified in a fenced enclosure since 1997, represent 4 respected healers who were Mahu, the Hawaiian word for a person of dual male and female spirit. Any inscription to their Mahu association, however, is glaringly absent from the monument's signage. The omission isn't surprising. More than 2 centuries after Christian missionaries first arrived in the archipelago, many native Hawaiian histories and traditions continued to be erased and obscured, deemed too unpalatable for Western Moors. Who could have seen this coming? Hawaii is still largely non-Hawaiian place to me, Wong Kalu says, and part of rectifying this is returning Mahu to the broad and inclusive meaning that the term held in pre-contact Hawaii. To be Mahu is a blessing, reminds Wong Kalu. To be Mahu is greater than the gender binary male-female, those who are ordinary people. I can see the world from 2 different sides, I can do things from 2 different sides, and so can a lot of other Mahu. Now, one thing we've noted here, and you'll see people popping off in the chat, from how many different civilizations now have had third or non-binary, gender non-conforming identities and traditions repressed because of settler colonialism. We've seen it in Africa. We've seen it in Hawaii. We've seen it in India. Following more than a decade straddling nonprofit community organizing and the public education system in the 2000s, she co-founded... When Wong Kalu was growing up in the 80s, the word Mahu was largely used as a transphobic and homophobic slur, the healing association of Mahu people not just forgotten, but replaced by nasty Western stigmas against gender variance. But artists and advocates like Wong Kalu have made it their mission to change that. In the 2000s, she co-founded Kalua Namamo, a native Hawaiian and transgender-led health organization, and served as a cultural director of Halau Lokahi, a charter school with a native curriculum. Wong Kalu was the eponymous subject of the 2014 feature documentary Kimuhina. The film, directed by filmmakers Dean Hammer and Joe Wilson, was celebrated for introducing Mahu as an indigenous paradigm to mainstream audiences across the U.S. and globe. They struck up a creative collaboration. The 3 went on to direct 2017's Ladies in Waiting and 2019's Lady Eva, 2 documentaries about the struggles of the Fakalaiti transgender community in Tonga before creating the Oscar shortlisted Kapa Mahu together in 2020. While the island, and like I've mentioned with all these other videos, I recommend anybody go and go and read the full articles. I will list all of my sources when the article goes up, or when the video goes up as a highlight. While the island's Mahu continue to reclaim these ancestral roles, finding community remains something of a timeless practice. At the Bishop Museum exhibit, there was another film featuring Hinale Moana Wong Kalu titled Country Mahu, also co-directed by Dean Hammer and Joe Wilson, of a quieter, more verite variety. Playing on a small video loop across the hall from where Kapa Mahu was being screened, the clip documents a visit by Wong Kalu to friends Paula Chandelier and the late Dana Kauailiki. Is that an L or a I? Kauailiki, 2 Mahu living in backcountry lifestyle on Kauai. For any indigenous folks, I'm so sorry about the pronunciation. I'm trying. They hug each other in a yard where boars graze beneath the shade of a kuki tree. Then, outfitted in parios, with hair twisted in loose buns, Chandler dances a hula as Wong Kalu chants and Kauailiki drums an age-old beat. It's a hula for Hiaika, a female kupua or shapeshifter. These are my friends who help to ground me and center me and remind me of how to just be happy existing in my life as I am, Wong-Lu says in the clip, her voice sliding into a restive note. It's part of the magic around traditional Mahu. This is a little cheeky. This is more of like a blog, but I still think it's really good information, so I wanted to read it out. Allow me to cordially introduce you to the first deity on our Egyptian polytheism list, Atum. The god/Des Atum was the first deity to exist in the Egyptian pantheon and was also the first intersex deity in the group. Besides being a massive... come back. There we go. Besides being a massive overachiever for all this, and kind of the deity version of that kid was always asking to be the line leader on field trip, the god Des also sired several children. How did Atum reproduce these offspring? Essentially the same way my 8th grade sex ed teacher told me reproduction happens, by vomiting them out of her mouth. Atum was not alone either. Next up on our list is Hapi, the swell intersex deity of the Nile River. As if being able to add an accolade like that to a job resume wasn't already incredibly cool, Hapi also had blue skin. Along with the blue hue, Hapi rocked an androgynous associated look with feminine associated large breasts and round stomach, and a masculine associated wrap skirt and Egyptian false beard, an accessory designed for nobility. It is safe to speculate that Hapi would have been considered genderqueer due to their attempt to indicate their androgyny and androgynous associated gender presentations. The pharaoh was assigned female at birth, but it is speculated that they quite possibly were gender fluid rather than female. This hypothesis is the topic of much discussion, as a concrete answer cannot be found on whether they were an ancient member of the LGBTQIA community or merely queering gender to circumvent the sexism of the era. Now, that's actually a super interesting thing, and the reason I wanted to bring this up to talk about Hatshepsut is because, like we talked about in our kind of queer Old West video, is that because it's like historically just always been worse to be a woman, there is a much wider lack of trans-masculine representation, or what we would see as trans-masculine representation, likely because historically they might have been more erased than trans-feminine people who were seen by historians as male. Briefly after Queen Hatshepsut assumed the throne of Egypt, they began alternating between male-associated and female-associated attire. While the majority of their attire vacillated, they kept one constant to their ensembles, the extravagant wood false beard worn by pharaohs. Speaking of the word pharaoh, this leads us seamlessly into our next fact. Hatshepsut renounced the title of queen to assume the moniker pharaoh, a title previously reserved exclusively for men. This decision occurred quickly after acquiring the throne. In tandem with this unprecedented, pioneering decision, they would later shift from using she, her pronouns to an interchanging use of both masculine and feminine ones. My favorite factoid, however, is how they were increasingly rendered in art as gender ambiguous. By the end of their reign, depictions of Hatshepsut consistently possessed a conventionally ancient Egyptian masculine physicality, shirtless without breasts, while incorporating the conventionally feminine attribute of a waist smaller than those of his, her, cis male counterparts. Lest we forget that members of the LGBTQIA community are much, much more than one-dimensional caricatures, Hatshepsut was here to remind us. They're widely regarded as one of the most successful pharaohs in the history of ancient Egypt. We're talking, quote, they reigned for a lengthy 22 years, during which they brought about one of the most tranquil and successful eras the empire would ever see prolific. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the Japanese Wakashu, which, again, if you want to know why you probably haven't heard about this or it's not as widely known, it began getting cracked down on after Japan made contact with the West and opened up for trade. So, thanks. So the thing about the Wakashu that you need to understand is that we have to talk about them in the same terms we talk about like old royal marriages in Europe, or really just kind of any marriage and sex in anywhere for a really great deal of history. And that is to say, that if you were underage, you were very likely preyed upon by older men. Older women too, but older men in particular. Like what we would consider underage now was unfortunately normalized to exploit and abuse in old times. Like we as a society have thankfully moved past that, right? For the most part. But it's important to understand these things because you can't necessarily view the roles that were inhabited at this time through that lens because it was not seen as a bad thing. That doesn't mean it wasn't a bad thing. You know, it's like so many other things throughout history. Like we have history of ritual sacrifice, Romans battling people in colosseums. Like the history of the world is full of things that were not condemned in their time that were still very, very bad. But that doesn't mean that you cannot still learn from them or that they do not represent something like gender nonconformity and gender ambiguity. The Wakashu were, broadly speaking, male youths transitioning between a child and an adult, but they were also more than just young men, occupying their singular space with unique roles, conventions, and most crucially, their own style. Indeed, Wakashu were identified primarily through their clothes and hairstyles. They wore their hair in a top knot with a small shaved portion at the crown and long forelocks at the side, as opposed to adult men who shaved the entire crown of their heads. Their clothes are similar to those worn by unmarried young women, colorful kimonos with long flowing sleeves. So, in a word, they're kind of femboys, in a way. Wakashu usually range between 7 to early 20s. However, youth in Edo, Japan must be understood as a more fluid term, one that is not connected solely to biological age. Often the family or the young boy himself could decide on the beginning and end of the Wakashu phase. Practically every Japanese male went through a Wakashu stage, which ended with a coming-of-age ceremony called Genpuku, denoted by changes in clothing and hairstyle. After this ceremony, they would take up their roles as men in society. However, some chose to delay their coming-of-age ceremony beyond their 20s or to remain a Wakashu for large parts of their lives. Now, here's the real problem. And this is, again, this is a thing that you can acknowledge without saying it's a good thing, because it certainly is not. But it still remains a part of studying this, right? Wakashu were connected to sexuality. As youth, they were considered largely free from the burdens and responsibilities of adulthood, but regarded as sexually mature. As we just saw in the previous paragraph, they mentioned that they could be as young as 7 sometimes. And there is no way, like that is not sexually mature. Like in a historical context, in a modern context, whatever lens you want to look at that through, that is not sexually mature. That is assault. That is abuse. Like straight up. There is no historical excuse you can give to that, right? Like that's awful. That's horrendous. The sad state of affairs, the sad truth about history is that for up until about 3 minutes ago, in the relative scheme of everything, history has been constantly angled towards whatever appeases and pleases the most powerful nearby man. That's just the truth. And many, many, many of those men have had horrendous and voracious appetites. Go and look at the totality of young girls who were married off as princesses or queens below the age of 13. Like, this is not, I know some people would like to try and make this into a queer thing. It's not. It's a men have always liked power and people have always loved asserting it over other people thing, really. The range of Wakashu extended into the 20s and beyond. So it is also not fair to exclusively label this as a thing that we would call pedophilic today. Because probably quite a few of these relationships would be completely acceptable by modern standards, whether homosexual or heterosexual. This is why these conversations are important to have, because you have to kind of deconstruct to understand. It's not just something that you can look at and label as one thing or the other. As an object of desire for men and women, they had sex with both genders. The intricate social rules that governed the appearance of Wakashu also regulated their sexual behavior. With adult men, Wakashu assumed a passive role, but with women, a more active one. Relationship between two Wakashu were not tolerated. Any sexual relationship with men ended after a Wakashu completed his coming-of-age ceremony. Gender fluidity in Edo Japan had its limits. Wakashu were always biological male. Women could dress up like a Wakashu, but they did not enjoy the same sexual liberties, although depictions of female prostitutes dressing like Wakashu to attract customers of both sexes survived, that is actually super fascinating to me. Like the way that you can unwrap and try and deconstruct how that toys with gender, the idea of prostitutes presenting themselves as, for lack of a better term, I think obviously there's a much bigger cultural significance and a ritual significance to Wakashu, but presenting themselves as like a near analog would be like a femboy to attract both men and women, that is fascinating. That is a fascinating example of gender nonconformity to me. Their youth, elaborate clothes, and connection to sexuality made Wakashu a popular motif of ukiyo-e woodblock prints. These images from a floating world were a mass medium, designed not for the higher classes, but for increasing middle class. These depictions showed Wakashu engaging in seemingly innocent pastimes such as playing instruments and taking a stroll, as well as in sexual acts with both men and women. The range of Wakashu images survived, though casual viewers today would most likely have trouble identifying them as such. Long-sleeve kimonos, elaborate poses, and sensuous facial expressions can be found among images of both Wakashu and women, and it is almost impossible to distinguish a Wakashu from a courtesan, or indeed any young lady. Often it is only their hairstyle that differentiates them. For the second half of the 19th century, Wakashu had effectively disappeared. What happened? Beginning in 1635, Japan had followed a strict seclusion policy known as sakoku. For 2 centuries, the country had been almost totally isolated from the world, and so a distinctive Japanese culture with its own moral and sexual codes developed and thrived. This seclusion ended in 1854 when the black ships of the U.S. Commodore Matthew Perry arrived in Edo Bay to negotiate treaties that would result in the opening of the country to Western trade and influences. Perry's black ships were the trigger for unparalleled changes in virtually all areas of Japanese society, culminating in the creation of a centralized Japanese nation-state under the Meiji Emperor in 1868. In the span of a few decades, Japan saw an unparalleled influx of Western ideas and people. At the same time, Japanese people were sent to Europe and the United States to bring back knowledge in the areas of science, economics, politics, and military and medicine. With breathtaking speed, Japan transformed from a feudal state into a modern nation. Crucially, Japan did not only import Western technology, but also Christian and Victorian morals and ethics. With Western norms and values came the prevalence of a strict male-female dichotomy. So, with that out of the way, as we've talked about in the past, those are just a few of the examples that we see throughout history of every culture. Like there's so many more, even on that map we were looking at the beginning. But I want to talk about one little last thing about trans quote-unquote ideology, right? Because one thing we hear a lot, so many people like to say John Money invented gender ideology. Now, we talked about this a bit at the beginning, but I want to go over who is John Money. Okay, so here's the case of David Remar. In 1966, a botched circumcision left 8-month-old Remar without a penis. Money persuaded the baby's parents that sex reassignment surgery would be in Remar's best interest. At the age of 22 months, he underwent an orchiectomy, in which his testicles were surgically removed. He was assigned to be raised as female, and his name changed from Bruce to Brenda. Money further recommended hormone treatment, which the parents agreed. Money then recommended a surgical procedure to create an artificial vagina, which the parents refused. Money published a number of papers reporting the reassignment as successful. David Remar was raised under the optimum gender rearing model in 1966. It was a common model for sex and gender socialization, medicalization for intersex youth. The model was heavily criticized for being sexist and for applying an arbitrary gender identity. Starting when Remar and his twin Brian were 6 years old, Money showed the brothers pornography and forced the two to rehearse sexual acts. Money would order David to get down on all fours, blah, blah, blah. John Money is an awful person and is not the basis for trans-affirming care. However, because he was an awful person who people who don't understand trans people or trans healthcare can point to and say, look, he forcibly transitioned this kid and look how awful they turned out. They're able to try and use him as kind of boogeyman of trans healthcare, right? The thing about John Money's experiment is that it was an absolute failure in every way, and not in the way that many anti-trans advocates would like you to believe. Because it turns out, as proven, you cannot force someone to identify as a gender identity they don't identify with. It is literally the proof positive that all the people saying, oh, stop transing kids, stop trying, like, you can't do that. The mind doesn't allow it. It breaks against it. And it is a horrible and terrible story. If you wanted to actually say that there's somebody who is the president, the creator, the innovator of gender ideology, I would put it to you, dear viewer, that it is instead Harry Benjamin who deserves that title, along with Magnus Hirschfeld, who we'll talk about in a moment. Now, Harry Benjamin was actually born and off and running in his work. He earned a medical degree in 1912. Before Magnus Hirschfeld was, or before, he earned a medical degree in 1912. Before John Money was even born. He earned his medical degree before John Money was even born. Benjamin earned a medical degree. Scientific study of sexuality, though not part of his formal medical training, was one of Benjamin's early interests, and his understanding was strengthened through his friendship with Magnus Hirschfeld, one of the founding fathers of sexology. Now, Magnus Hirschfeld, of course, we know from our World War II history, the founder of the Hirschfeld Institute, that was a pioneer sexology institute that was burned down by the Nazis. Benjamin's politics brought him into the circle of sexual radicals at the time, including Margaret Sanger and Alfred Kinsey. In 1948, Kinsey recommended a patient to Benjamin. Born male, the patient expressed an acute desire to become a woman. At the time, the recommended treatment for such individuals, such as Benjamin's patient, was psychoanalytic therapy aimed at making the mind fit the body. Benjamin, however, was unconvinced of the effectiveness of that approach. Seeing gender identity on a continuum, mind you, this is 1948. He believed some people could be born male but feel female, and that more sensible treatment would be to alter the body to better fit the patient's perceived gender. He counseled the patient to travel to Europe, where surgeons performed one of the earliest gender reassignment operations. Benjamin ultimately gained a reputation among people seeking to change their sex as a medical expert sympathetic to their plight. As we'll see here, the thing about Harry Benjamin is that while he was a pioneer in this kind of research, many other people, it was not seen as acceptable to pursue this kind of research. It was still considered verboten. In 1966, he published The Transsexual Phenomenon, which drew on his work with clients who had a variety of sexual disorders. He argued that transsexuals were a group distinct from transvestites, we've talked about this at the beginning, and homosexuals, which is also true. While he acknowledged that overlap between groups was certainly possible, he argued against collapsing them into one category of sexual pathology, as each condition required a different treatment approach. He also challenged the dominant psychological treatment of transsexuality. He argued that psychoanalysis did not lessen the desire to change sex. It simply forced patients to undergo with their desires and lead miserable lives, to go underground with their desires and lead miserable lives. These ideas, this guy, not entirely right, but he's got the spirit far more than John Money ever did. He basically lays out our modern conception and how we understand gender, and more importantly, gender expression and transition, and how that can benefit the mind. This is closer to our modern understanding of what gender can be as a study, as a field of medicine, right? Which is why I wanted to go over this. Because so much of the work I do is to try and illuminate, to try and educate, to try and help people push back against narratives that are presented to them. So to kind of go with, as a capstone to talking about trans people through history, in this modern era where we are understood more than ever, when people are still trying to understand more than ever, I think it is important to know, next time somebody says John Money, the man who invented gender ideology, it's important to know he didn't actually do that. People like this were doing the hard work and doing it right in that exact same time period. And more people should know about that.